Hey everyone, good evening. This is Nevin, your host of New Ideas podcast. It used to be called the Politically Homeless podcast because that pretty much defines my politics, very eclectic. With me is Dylan Burns, who's a bit of a citizen journalist. He's been very active in national politics for a number of years, also has a podcast himself. He's very experienced, DylanBurnsTV. Dylan and I served on a panel when we discussed nationalism and globalism, and we got to exchange some, good information on various geopolitical topics. And we appreciate Dylan's approach and views on Ukraine, because on this program, we highlight the threat of Russia and China and their allies. And I sent you a Substack. I don't know if you had a chance to look through it or not. It is lengthy, on my position on Ukraine, and it's one of the most critical conflict areas that's under the literal gun of Russia as well as its allies. So welcome to the program. I know you're recording me on your end, which I appreciate. How you doing, Dylan?
I'm doing good. I'm back in the States for a little bit longer. Going to be heading out next 16, 17 days, headed back to Europe, going to get back to filming. Still a lot more work to do. The 24-hour peace deal was, I think, lost in the mail, and so I still got a lot of filming I got to get done.
Yeah, I'm sure. Unfortunately, I think this is going to be happening for a long time. Unfortunately, the conflict. So I wanted to go into a little bit about your background. I'd like to do that on my show to introduce people who might not be familiar with you. It might be kind of redundant for your audience. I mean, my apologies to your audience, but I want to get a sense of where you're coming from. I know I've read your biography, but people might not know where you started politically. So tell us a little bit about your political evolution, where you stand ideologically on the political spectrum, on economics, and especially foreign affairs.
Sure. So I grew up outside of D.C. I grew up in gorgeous Prince George's, Maryland. So I was always surrounded by a certain amount of politics. My grandfather worked as a machinist for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. He helped design the new $100 bills that had like the security stripes on them and all of that stuff. Worked with CNC machines. So I would go into DC, I would be surrounded by politics. And sometimes I remember, I was raised by my grandparents and they'd ask, where did you get all this politics from? I was like, you raised me outside of Washington, DC. I don't know exactly what you expected. But I first got involved in some local Maryland politics, stuff in my city, stuff in my state. I, interned at the Maryland General Assembly. But I think one of my big first time assignments on federal politics was working for the Mike Gravel campaign as the Maryland State Director for president. It was a campaign where we knew he was not going to become president of the United States, but we thought that there had been some certain foreign policy failings. I thought particularly in Yemen that we could use, the Mike Gravel campaign as a messaging device. And from there, I worked on some other campaigns. I started working for 21st Century Democrats, a small political PAC, when it comes to some data management and other stuff, and just tried to pick up as much information as I could before I started some political streaming and broadcasting. Originally, just because, I had some interviews on some shows and went well, and I wanted to see what I could make of it. But eventually it became a full-time job. I started a panel show and I was able to get my start until eventually the war happened and everything changed.
Yeah, so what got you, and you could ask about my political background. Actually, I would encourage you, so it makes it more of a flowing conversation, but I mean, it's, up to you at the end of the day. But what got you into foreign affairs? I mean, you did touch on a little bit your longtime interest, obviously, your interest in politics overall. And what got you interested in Ukraine? And just to backtrack before we get into that, where do you stand politically and ideologically, let's say, on economics and political structures and whatnot?
Well, no matter where I stand, I usually stand on 2 feet. As for where I was, where I chose to get involved in foreign affairs, I remember in middle and early high school, following the Syrian civil war, using open source information that was coming out. There was this website called Live Map where you could watch every single piece of footage, get maps to where everything was happening, so you could figure out where ISIS controlled, where the FSA controlled, where the Assad regime controlled, where the SDF controlled, what at the time, at the early stages, YPG, YPJ, another militia. But and I found that fascinating to me, that I could have access to that type of information, that back in the 1930s, like a president would pay top dollar to be able to have something mapped out like this, where 3 hours ago this happened here, and you'd have to have all these informants around the globe in order to get this type of information. And I, while stuffing my face with public school cheese sandwiches, can look at this information myself. And that started to get me a lot more interested in foreign affairs. And I think what really solidified it is when I got accepted into a program at the University of Maryland while I was still in high school to study international relations a little bit. And I think that kind of hooked me, and I never looked back.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of dovetails a little bit up. If you don't mind, I'll discuss a little bit about my background so you get to know where I'm coming from. I'm from New York originally. I live in South Florida now. I have a double major in political and history from State University of New York at Albany. I'm now a librarian by my profession, been doing that for over 20 years. I got interested in foreign affairs. I grew up during the last 10 years of the Cold War. I was born in 1974. So I grew up in the shadow of the Soviet threat. My stepfather used to be an MP in the U.S. military in Fort Bragg, educated me on the threat of communism and totalitarianism in general. And there was an extreme distrust of Marxism, Leninism. And, of course, he also got me interested in the history of World War II and the dangers of fascism and National Socialism. So I really started to grow very interested in me. He got me hooked on foreign affairs, national security issues. Really, national security is my bedrock issue and how it intersects with politics and economics in general. And so I started this podcast, started a Substack article and whatnot. My political ideology, I would say also, I stand on both feet as well, to mimic your quip. I would call myself a radical civic nationalist. You probably think, what in the hell is that? I mean, I've had some people think, oh, you're a fascist or something. I'm like, no. I'm like, fuck no. I'm Jewish. I have a daughter who's LGBTQ and interracial relationship. I'm much more politically, classically liberal by comparison, not a fascist by any stretch of the imagination. It's basically old school radical centrism of the mid to the beginning of the 20th century. If you've heard of Scoop Jackson, the former Democratic senator from Washington State from the 1950s until he died in 1983, it's basically that New Deal populism or New Deal capitalism with a healthy dose of American school economic nationalism, not as practiced by MAGA today, but something more deliberate and strategic, as well as a sort of colorblind ideology that's accepting of all Americans in a level of diversity, as well as also a strong national security policy, but that avoids the extremes of hyper-interventionism, of neoconservatism, as well as extreme forms of isolationism where you stick your head in the sand. Oh, there are no threats out there. Russia, China, Cold War ended. Nothing to see here. No threats to liberalism and democracy. So that's where I stand, pretty much. And that's what I talk quite a bit about these issues on my podcast. I do think that unchecked capitalism is, I believe in capitalism very strongly, but unchecked capitalism has opened us up to multiple national security dangers as well as dangers to the social equilibrium. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, I got you. I mean, I understand what a radical civic nationalist is. I would say that in fact, I would say from coming where I am, I could probably relate to that more than most people because I grew up around the DC area, connected there by the metro system. The federal layoffs that are happening right now are skyrocketing unemployment in my town, in my city. And it's affecting like local restaurants who are not getting as much business. It's affecting everywhere. And the people that are being laid off, in my opinion, many of them are people I would describe in this manner. And many times our federal workers are civil personnel are treated in a way as if they're leeches who are taking off of public dime, who are, just kind of going around, kind of pencil pushers, managing everybody. But these are some of the most patriotic people in the world who, in many instances, could take higher pay working for private industry, who have instead chosen to serve their country because they understand that someone has to actually physically hold the torch. It isn't as simple as saying, we've secured our rights, yippee, and then it's like you ride off into the sunset. If you put that torch down ever, it extinguishes. And it is their job to hold that torch. And to dedicate your entire life to that, you either have to really love the benefits or really, I think, have that kind of civic dedication that you could call yourself like a civic nationalist. I understand that. I understand that a lot.
No, and I appreciate that. It's just the term radical. Now, you probably think, why radical? I'm sure you probably could figure it out probably by if you checked out my works or just, you're obviously listening to what I'm saying policy-wise, because I call for the break from Reaganomics or Clintonomics, neoliberalism, total market fundamentalism. And in the Washington consensus, and even to some degree on some of the streamers, they view that as sacrosanct. I don't, for a number of reasons that you could ask me about or we could discuss on the show if you want on this episode. There's also, you mentioned the layoffs as a result of DOGE earlier in the Trump administration that are still more or less going on from what I understand. And we know that the Russians and the Chinese, this has been reported by the press through sources within CIA and FBI counterintelligence, that they're making approaches to these laid off employees very easy, because it's basically saying, hey, we got money for you. We're going to get secrets and whatnot and try and get whatever we can, fuck capitalism, fuck the feds, and fuck Trump. Pardon the language. If you don't want me cursing, that's fine. I'm just trying to make a point. Come work for us. We're going to give you secure pay. See, your federal government abandoned you. And I'm sure that's the recruiting tactics that they probably use, more or less. Now, there's another issue, which I believe you have spoken about very vociferously when it was occurring, basically the destruction of USAID and associated bureaucracies. When this is reported in the mainstream press, you have Belarus, you have Venezuela, you have Russia, you have Hungary. Hungary under Orban is is becoming more and more aligned for years with the Russians and the Chinese. They were all hailing it. Even the untrustworthy government in El Salvador under Bukele is portrayed as this great guy. Well, I mean, first of all, I don't agree with what's going on in CCOT and with the deportation of immigrants and the imprisonment with that. It smelled a corrupt deal when I first heard about it. But anyways, Juan Rojas for American Affairs, who's been on the program here, New Ideas, he wrote about how Bukele actually leaned towards the double dealings and leaned also at times towards Cuba and China. And his government hailed the destruction of USAID. So there's national security imperative too as well. And when you look at these facts, I used to be a conservative, a very active one. I worked for the Allen West campaign. I worked for the Mike Lemire campaign. I advocated for Trump in 2015, 2016 on America's Survival and Accuracy in Media's Roku TV. So, but my support for the Republicans eroded over time, and it's especially through policies like this ideologically driven austerity and greed that really unweaves the fabric of our society, as well as makes us vulnerable to foreign adversaries, and it also destroys people's lives and careers. I see the public sector. In my job, I see people that are struggling and whatnot, and you also combine with the fact with doing the research on deindustrialization and financialization and how it's hollowed out, quote, middle America, as well as cities and even suburbs. It's a huge, huge problem. And then another blackpilling event was how a number of the Tea Party Republicans would all vote for permanent normal trade relations, most of them in the House and the Senate for permanent normal trade relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia. They all fell over themselves. I remember following the PNTR, that stands for Permanent Normal Trade Relations, for those of you who might not be familiar with the acronym, for Communist China. When I watched the debates on C-SPAN in 1999 and 2000, how people on the anti-CCP side were passionate and desperate. Don't pass this. Don't give PNTR for China. I mean, the other side, the corporate Republicans and corporate Democrats, knew the consequences. They knew what a bad actor Communist China was and is, but they ignored that. So when I see that occurring, Grover Norquist of ATR, Americans for Tax Reform, and other Tea Party and so-called libertarian or so-called free market groups are advocating trade with all these tyrannies and geopolitical adversaries, I started to look into and ask myself questions. Well, they're bitching about socialism and quote high taxes, but yet they have no problem dealing with collectivist or authoritarian socialist so-called tyrannies. And I started to sense the double standards. And I'm quite autistic about that topic because not a lot of people talk about it. So, you know, there's a national security edge too.
I think when we talk about like not only laying off a lot of these federal employees, but also the people that we've allowed to slide their slimy asses into these buildings. These DOGE pencil neck freaks don't know what they're doing. They're being given immense power over people with 30, 40 years experience who have to walk up to these people who know nothing about their field and explain and justify their existence and their work to somebody who has no frame of reference. And so, and not to mention no constitutional or congressional authority to be making the cuts that they ultimately made and then got away with. They kind of let Congress pick up the slack afterwards, or in many instances just knew that since they controlled Congress, Congress would not do their job, which is to be a hold on the president of the United States, even if you could get a majority of them to agree that things like emergency broadband, infrastructure for like radio stations might be important, or you might be able to get them to agree that, you know, some of this USAID programs are pretty important and they do save a lot of lives and do give us a lot of influence that would otherwise we would need to use much harder hard power, much more expensive hard power, but ultimately they won't stand up to him. And so that meant these sleuths like Big Balls got the run of the mill, and they got access to a bunch of information, our information, everyday Americans' information, and we really don't know how safe that information was treated or if that information was ascertained by bad actors. And when we see the people at the top of the pyramid butt dialing in journalists into like national security events, like military strikes that endanger the lives of U.S. personnel, it causes me to just almost like throw my hands up. Like, I mean, it's so stupid. It's so comedic. If somebody wrote a parody about Trump, like in 2015 going into being president, people would say this is too unrealistic. This just seems like some MSNBC nonsense. But that's where we are when it comes to the standards of which our bureaucracy is treated. And so I think it's only a matter of time until we have another big leak national security problem. When we have this gaggle of fools where no expertise was prioritized in the selection process. Pete Hegseth knows how to shoot a gun. That is his one qualifying trait for being Secretary of Defense. And I'm pretty sure he can slam it on the rocks, which is the second only qualifying trait for being Secretary of Defense, being able to drink heavily. But besides those two traits, he has got nothing else. And when you go down the entire cabinet, it's like this. And so when you put somebody who doesn't know what they're doing at the head of the snake, you should not be surprised when they keep making these basic mistakes, like Steve Witkoff having the Russians choose their translator for him. These are things that don't happen if you have somebody who knows what they're doing. But loyalty is what was chosen first. Loyalty. And if you don't serve that first as a lifelong civil servant of 40 years, then you might find yourself on the chopping block.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear what you're saying. I wanted to add on, because I actually, concerning some of the DOGE staffers like Edward Korstein, the 19-year-old entrepreneur, he founded a company called Tesla Sexy LLC, and it controlled 2 Russian registered domain. And as I wrote, this presents national security issue. And another domain under his control um, showed dealt with another showed content in Chinese that stated the service provided multiple encrypted cross-border networks. So he also had his ties with the Chinese. So these individuals, as far as we know, were not vetted properly, unless there's some information that people in the audience can direct me to. But these people were not vetted. They were just basically pulled off the street. It was basically an ideologically and special interest driven agenda. You remember Elon Musk posted on X in 2024, where he talked about, I am looking for small government, high IQ revolutionaries. That's not prudence. Secondly, I mean, look, I let me lend my experience here. I've been a library manager or a branch manager of a small community library since about 2015, was a professional librarian and a student library page previously to that. I've worked for the library system since 1998. When you're a leader, you have to get, and if you want efficiency, and I am all for efficient government, believe me, I think you are too. However, you have to get the buy-in for people. I had a colleague of mine who was the head of a circulation department of one of the libraries in Broward County. And he was tasked, from what I heard, to revamp operations years and years and years ago at this library location. So what he did was he was polite, he sat there, he observed everything, took mental notes, probably notes with a pencil or pen, see everything that's doing, you see what works, what doesn't work, and then you develop a rapport with the staff, a sense of trust while you're doing this, and then you come back and say, okay, we need to do this, this, and this in order to make operations better. To me, that's leadership. And that's what's lacking in this administration, because in part, this ties in back with Project 2025. It's an ideological goal to create the equivalent. I don't know if you've seen the movie 2073 or if you saw the sci-fi series Incorporated. It's basically a combination of
More of a Westerns guy.
I'm sorry?
More of a Westerns guy.
Oh, okay. I'm more of an alternative historical fiction scenario guy. But it basically shows a hybridized politically sloppy authoritarianism and plutocracy. And I think that's the end game of this administration, to be honest with you. And then, of course, that ties in with the ideas of Curtis Yarvin, whose influences are felt in the administration, supposedly even by his own admission, the more younger, youthful staffers. So what are your thoughts about what I say? Because then I want to segue into the Trump administration policies on Russia. And I know you had on WIC a bit of a debate with some various streamers, and some of which really raises some concerns, and I really wanted to talk to you about that. So what are your thoughts about what I had to say about the end game of the Trump administration, the influence of Curtis Yarvin, and then we'll move on to Russia, Ukraine, and whatnot.
I mean, I think Trump himself wants the authority to do whatever Trump wants to do in the moment, and the checks and balances to him are more seen as like a hurdle than as part of the system. He doesn't really have any like institutional dedication to, say, the democratic result of an election, as we could have seen from last time, or to the power of the courts. From many times they have stepped over the court's authority, or where Trump very clearly doesn't really care about the letter of the law. He's just using his lawyers to try to find a legal way to do things. Like where Rudy Giuliani went on Fox and Friends during the first term and said, when it came to the Muslim ban, Trump came to him and asked, how do we legally ban Muslims? Because he knew he couldn't legally ban Muslims. Yeah. And that's where they came up with the list of countries. And were able to, and they had to correct it before the courts, because the court said it was pretty clear you were just trying to ban Muslims. And it was the corrected version that eventually went through. So I don't think he has any deep dedication to the law. As for like the type of Curtis Yarvin philosophy speak, I think Trump is a kind of a chameleon. And he'll just kind of take whatever justifies his action in the immediate moment. And he tends to lean towards more nationalist and populist rhetoric of a right-wing tint. As for J.D. Vance, he might buy into it a lot more. It's a lot harder to say, because J.D. Vance has gone through a very quick political transformation from, I am the son of somebody who was addicted to dope and I believe Donald Trump is similar to heroin, to I believe he's the greatest president ever. That is a pretty gigantic transformation. This is a short period of time. So it's really hard to judge how genuine that is to happen in half a decade. But if there is a genuineness there, he does seem to be a lot more tinted towards the new right that treat Curtis Yarvin not as a circus show, but as like a serious philosopher.
Well, yeah, Vance has even admitted and quoted Yarvin and this whole concept of rage, retire all government employees, which ties in with the let's get rid of the administrative state, Bannon, who spoke about that in 2016, which is kind of ironic for a nationalist and populist. It's a bit of a contradiction because in order to have an effective form of nationalism and populism, you have to have an administrative state. I mean, John Judas, probably familiar with him, said the only thing that can really curb the power of private sector oligarchs who are largely globalist in orientation is the state, is the government. You need that referee, that balancing force. So really, I just find it just intellectually incoherent, which is a problem of modern conservatism in general. So, but yeah, Yarvin, I know some of the tech billionaires like Mark Andreessen and others who are close to the administration. They are close to Yarvin, and they've admitted that, Andreessen in particular, in interviews. You have Elon Musk, although he's kind of out of the administration, so it seems. Supposedly he's been in touch with Yarvin too, with his whole new, I think it's called the America Party, that he at least has as a online X project. I don't know if it's really gotten off the ground or not in real life, but apparently he's been in touch with Yarvin too as well. So he has this network. There's a tremendous amount of money behind it. And as for J.D. Vance, going back to him, one other comment about him, he was a sort of your standard establishment Republican back in the day, with, the heavy helping of bootstrapper rhetoric and whatnot, which has its social Darwinist tinge to it. And then apparently when he converted to Catholicism, he became more of a populist and nationalist Republican, for tariffs, economic nationalism, and even critical of deregulation, and even supportive, at least on a surface and in a shallow way, to some degree, of labor unions. And I'm a very big supporter of unions as an institution, by the way, very passionate about that. So yeah, that's my take.
You are supportive of unions or not?
Oh, absolutely. I have union leaders on my program. I'm a member of my union. I'm 110% supportive of unions, and I can go into that, go on an hour on why I am. But, getting to the issue of Russia, and by virtue of that, Ukraine, what I see and what other geopolitical analysts like J.R. Nyquist, who also, like you, knows Ukrainians and is sourced with a number of them, he's more right-wing on a lot of other issues than I am. But him and I have a strong anti-communist, anti-totalitarian focus. And what we both notice, and he has talked to people in the periphery of the Trump administration and inside a little bit, not going to go into too many details. He's obviously mentioned some of it on our last show. And there is a conflict within the administration, and there are forces apparently that feel that Germany and England are the actual communist country, and Russia is this Christian and nationalist country. And what we see is there's a lot of contradictions with the Russia-Ukraine policy on the surface.
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you see these cancellations and suspensions of aid in order to be ready for a war with China, even though many of the munitions, our own Defense Department saying, oh, there's no shortage in that. There's no shortage in that. MLRS rockets. Where are we going to use MLRS rockets against the Chinese off the shores of Taiwan? Doesn't make much sense. At least 155 millimeter shells is debatable. At least that kind of makes sense. The Taiwanese need those types of shells. But those types of LRS rockets, it didn't make any sense. And these suspensions also being done in the middle of negotiations, they send a message, not a good message either, a message of we don't give a fuck, a message of we'll completely take our foot off the gas. And these decisions were being done under the nose of Donald Trump. Pete Hegseth and Eldridge Colby, the undersecretary, were undersecretary on policy, made these decisions outside of the president's purview. So when he was being asked questions by the press about this announcement, about this decision, he was completely left in the blank. He was completely left in the dark, and he had to reverse it. And apparently they tried to do that 4 or 5 times. And so there is real conflict in the Trump administration. People say that Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg are like part of the better forces. But when the best force you have in the White House, like Keith Kellogg, is put in a position where he thinks he has to say things like the Ukrainians are like a barnyard animal that need to be beaten into submission, like he said when he talked about them being a mule that needed to be hit by a 2x4, then that's not the best. It's not the best person to plant your hopes upon.
Yeah, no, that's a good summation. And when you look at the first Trump administration, when it comes to COVID and China, and Peter Navarro, I mean, might not be your favorite person, but one of his latest books that he wrote shortly after the Joe Biden was elected, I forget the name of it. I could run in the other room and find it and get the copy and show it. But the point is that there was a war within the Trump administration between the anti-communists and civic nationalist types like Peter Navarro and a tiny handful of other individuals, Robert Lighthizer, who was actually a good USTR representative in the U.S. Trade Representative Office, for those of you who don't know the acronym. There was a literal war between that. And I think as we speak, that's going on right now. My guess is General Kellogg, Marco Rubio, Peter Navarro, and others on the one end. And then you have Tulsi Gabbard, you have David Beatty. I mean, that man is bad. And he's an undersecretary of state. And this guy, and I covered this, and many other people have covered it. For all I know, you probably covered him. He's an undersecretary of state. He's involved with public diplomacy, if I recall correct me if I'm wrong. And he is given to pro-CCP, anti-Uyghur posts on X, pro-Russia posts, and everything else. It's like, what's going on here? You have others too.
You got Eldridge Colby retweeting Jackson Hinkle.
Yeah, there you go. Jackson Hinkle, who is I don't care what he calls himself. He's an unreconstructed Stalinist, for God's sakes, and it's just unbelievable. Look, I think there are people in the administration that are problematic, and I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to say anything problematic or controversial to myself in a public forum, but deeply problematic individuals. And yeah, Eldridge Colby, he gives this, and this is not a popular position. He gives a view that we can separate China and Russia. And I take the controversial position that way back during the middle to the later part of the Cold War, that the Sino-Soviet salute was deeply exaggerated at best. There are others, like former KGB Major Anatoli Golitsyn, who was highly controversial within the CIA during the 1960s and 1970s, argued that based on information that he was somewhat privy to, that it was actually a controlled deception to basically deceive the West into thinking that the communist monolith was weakening, essentially. I would argue at best, and I wrote about this on my Substack called Wilderness of Mirrors. I wrote a whole paper on this. And when there is a lot of covert collaboration between the two powers, because even if there is rivalry, they still have one goal, which is the displacement of the United States as the preeminent power and to create their own unipolar world, if you will. That's my opinion. That's something that Putin and Medvedev and many of the other high-level Russian leaders have stated very openly for the past at least 5+ years, even before their attack on eastern Ukraine. So Colby supports that along with Steve Bannon and many other people. I think that is just reckless and foolish. And China and Russia, they both have stated on a number of occasions that their partnerships is like this. I know you're aware of the fact that there not only has the People's Republic of China exported armored vehicles and other weapons to the Russian forces, but they've also apparently have also sent advisors and troops to that. On that
China
point,
China sent sent troops to help with the war.
from what I understand, supposedly.
If you have anything on that, please do send it over.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send it over. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly China has sent weapons, and that's easily documented. They sent armored vehicles and other weapons and whatnot. Of course, they continue to break the sanctions with oil trade, with electronics and whatnot. So, but I will find that out. I will look it up and I will send it to you through the DM on Discord. So what do you see? I know you talk about it a lot on your show to your audience, but for the benefit of my audience, what are your observations on the grounds of the Ukrainian performance in the battlefield and what they need from the West and including the United States?
I mean, I think that the Ukrainians, giving the manpower shortage, given the equipment shortages and the freezes and everything that they've dealt with, they've done as just about as well as you can expect. That is not to remove blame from the amount of graft that still does occur in certain parts of the armed forces. Definitely when it comes to publicly donated gear. That doesn't mean that there isn't like abuses or there aren't ridiculous orders that are meant to, please people up high instead of the people who are on the ground and can actually see the tree lines that have to be taken and how ridiculous it is. That doesn't mean that there still aren't problems to communication or command and control. Like, these are all still issues that the Ukrainian Armed Forces has to deal with, has to evolve on. But I don't think, even with marquee transformations and all of that, that the performance that they're being put out right now would transform too tremendously. I do think it would make the situation obviously a lot better, but I think that when we talk about how the battlefield is being defined by these large parts of the front line being held by a small portion of men with a lot of drones in order to cover a lot of territory, that fundamental math wouldn't change at all. I think the numbers game when it comes to Russian losses would improve. I think maybe they would be better with logistics, but a lot of these are also, like, when it comes to logistics problems, that's just a problem of supply. They need more ammunition. They need more investment in domestic Ukrainian industries, particularly when it comes to just the purchasing power disparity. In order to make a drone in Ukraine compared to the United States, it is much, 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 much cheaper, and the people on the ground have so much more knowledge. And so that investment is best served in Ukrainian factories where it is closest to the Ukrainian war effort, and that type of investment in production is a lot harder to just, oops, that flip was switched. That switch was flipped overnight. Oops, I guess that's over. I guess we're no longer getting supply. So I think that investment in Ukrainian domestic industry, of course, the problems with supply, I think a new AIDS package from the United States right now would do tremendous. And there is a bipartisan effort to do that with Lisa Murkowski and others to get that done, even though the odds right now obviously are quite stark. And I think that the Ukrainians still have a lot of reform to do, and they need to figure out this manpower crisis because look, they're still drafting people. 75% of the army is conscripts at this point. It's like, if they want to get more of the armed forces, they're going to have to conscript more people and make some tough decisions, or improve the quality of the force so much when it comes to reforms of command and control and the experience people are having, that people will be willing to volunteer in high enough numbers again. Both would probably be at the same time the best way to get the most men in the shortest period. But both are difficult for different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine doesn't have the same level of population, as we all know, as compared to Russia, despite Russia's birth rate challenges. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the political forces that are hostile to Ukrainian independence use that constantly as a cudgel to beat Ukraine over the head. But, and I gotta tell you, it, I'm not saying I blindly think we should just pour troops into Ukraine or do World War III over it. I point that out in my essay. I'm a cautious hawk, to be perfectly honest. I think the worst vote a senator, a congressman, a president, a defense secretary decisions to, in the case of the president and secretary of defense, is to send men and women, children to war. That's probably the worst decision you make. With that stated, I'm sorry, when I'm listening to some of these streams you're on, it's like people are making Ukraine, I don't want to say out to be the aggressor, but they don't mention that, look, Russia violated the terms of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where Ukraine gave up its Soviet-era nuclear arsenal. And Ukraine also had a tremendous technical talent at that time for the production of nuclear weapons, from what I remember and understand. And with that stated, Russia attacked, they infiltrated eastern Ukraine, as you know. I believe you've covered that in some of your debates, GRU Spetsnaz. There's a paper I can send to you if you want, or anybody who disputes it, or if you dispute it. In eastern Ukraine, there were undercover GRU Spetsnaz that were riling up the population to separate from Ukraine. I think it was a U.S. Army military paper, if I understand correctly. You might have read it. With that stated, it just, it just seems like that they're portraying Ukraine as just, Ukraine has to stop the war. Ukraine has to stop the war. Well, they didn't start the war, and there was no mention, as I said, of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And to be honest with you, unlike a lot of people who are, quote, nationalists, I take the view, and I talk about it in my paper, Russian, for those of you who want to read to get granular details of my views, it's on my Substack, Russian Aggression Towards Ukraine and Its Ultimate Goal for Europe. And I think there's a lack of appreciation, sadly, from many elements of the right, that Russia continues to pose a Cold War era threat to Europe with the express purpose of dismantling and neutralizing Europe.
Look, the ethics of it for some people don't matter or besides the point, so they obfuscate. That for some people, they are fine with the Russians dominating all the territories that they touch. Now, of course, is that philosophy applied consistently? No, Finland kind of throws a wrench in that. Is that philosophy applied consistently when it comes to Alaska? No, obviously that has to be treated differently. But there are some who just accept that that's like part of the purview. I think that that is something that J.D. Vance has probably accepted. I think that is something that somebody like Elbridge Colby has almost certainly accepted. And so they really kind of see this as kind of like a fool's errand. And so the ethics of it, I think, are mostly obfuscated because they don't want to admit that their policy is abandonment, that their policy is, we're just trying to find the quickest way out no matter how messy it leaves the situation. Because if you acknowledge the gulf when it comes to civil society rights that you have in Ukraine versus Russia, the gulf when it comes to how, for example, Baptists are treated in occupied territory with all of their congregations shut down. Mariupol used to have 20 congregations. Now they have none. I've spoken to a lot of these congregations, a lot of these people who have fled. My fixer is a Ukrainian Protestant who fled occupied Donetsk with his family. So, I mean, I could point to civil society, religious rights, when it comes to the practicing of one's culture and tongues in Russia now and in occupied territory. You can get captured. You can get abused for the language you speak. When it comes to the standard of living in occupied Donetsk for the last 12 years, how it's continued to deteriorate, how Ukrainians can clearly see what occupied Ukraine looks like versus Ukraine. And, you know, the opinion is, you know, people want running water. People don't want feces to be in a plastic bag and dropped out their window. People want to be able to criticize their government without being disappeared. And people want jobs. You know, they don't want to have all the young people to leave because there's just no job opportunities there anymore. And so, irrespective of the clear fact that Russia started this war, after Russia agreed to not start this war, after Ukraine gave up its atomic weapons, and we made a commitment to that, and America going back on its commitment, no matter how you paint it, makes us look like snakes, and all of the establishment snakes, and all of like, oh, we don't want to be like Henry Kissinger, we don't want to be like these people that are depicted with devil horns and, you know, flaming eyes in most pieces of media, and then they are immediately slide into the type of behavior that made people like kind of repel and disgust when you saw how Henry Kissinger talked about Bangladesh, or how other people made like very callous decisions of moral disrepute when it comes to our foreign policy. So I think that for them, it's more they've already made up their mind. They just have to obfuscate the morality of it. For example, we just had a gigantic attack on Kiev. Over nearly 600 drones, tons of missiles, killed over 22 people, civilians, damaged, even hit the British consulate building. And White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt comes out and says, it's very bad. I see that there's been strikes on both sides. Russia did this. Ukraine struck their oil refineries. Mm-hmm. One is a target that is making money for the war effort, where civilians are not dying en masse, and they are not dense urban housing where people sleep in the middle of the night and in these mass bombing attacks. There is really no comparison. And there's even discussions where Trump says to Zelensky, that's been reported, where he's kind of like, yeah, I understand you got to bring the pressure, bring the fight to them in order to, you know, get the Russians to the table. But then they do that and get penalized for it. And so there's, you know, not only is there no ethics being applied to it, there's no logic being applied to it.
You know, I mean, don't even get me started. I mean, first of all, what was mentioned on one of the streams where you were in the debate panel, I mean, you know, first of all, I want to ask you about Gonzalo Lira and his death. And
honestly,
really,
I just ignore it when people make comments. If they want to ask me about it, I'll give them my opinion on Gonzalo. It's just most people who are saying, like, remember Gonzalo, are not going to like what I have to say about the man. May God at least observe his soul.
Yeah, I mean, what was his deal? Was he actually, as Ukrainians officially charged, involved? I think they said that he was passing information or collaborating with the Russians. I mean, what is the deal?
Look, this is a guy who was a serial liar who often operated while in Ukraine as a stenographer for the Russian government and Russian propagandists to an extent that was ridiculous when he was showing certain strikes and certain like destruction numbers for the Ukrainians that are the type of stuff that even Russians will often roll their eyes at when like seeing Russian state TV regurgitate. And while at the same time cheerleading for the invading army when he's in a city where he can just go outside and see the destruction that is being caused, right? While he's cheerleading this. And instead, he stays in his apartment. And people calling him a journalist, he's not a journalist. If you just stay in your apartment all day and repost information from other people, you are not a journalist. At best, you can say you're a stenographer. You can say that you're a copy and paster. You can say that you're a blogger, maybe. Or maybe you could say that you're a commentator if you want to make yourself sound better. But you are not a reporter even, and you're certainly not a journalist. And so when it comes to him, his case is a simple propaganda case. He was publishing propaganda of the invading army meant to not only like discredit the armed forces of Ukraine, but also meant to undercut state security. It meant to make the situation seem much more bleak than it is. And the Ukrainians didn't like that. I wish he was just deported and that was the end of the situation. because it's not that. And, I think Gonzalo Lira makes it tougher for actual journalists, because when you think about it, Gonzalo Lira went up there and said a bunch of bullshit and is now getting treated like this during a war situation. If I would much rather be able to go out there and argue and yell for the person who gets arrested because they covered a corruption case too aggressively. But those cases where, there's people who visit the homes of those looking into corruption cases, paid thugs by rich, influential, in-power oligarchs or people who are in the know, those stories don't get publication in the West. There is examples of draft officers harassing top anti-corruption activists in Ukraine, where the local police force are harassing these people, and it's almost certainly horribly corrupt. None of this gets traction in the West when it comes to these people. It's clowns like Gonzalo Lira. So it makes me think it's ingenuine, and it makes me think that, they don't actually care about the state of affairs of Ukrainian journalistic society, because they don't seem to ever really talk about the major instances, just the ones that, are kind of canned for them by Russian propagandists.
Yeah, and here's the thing, not only that, also Russia's human rights violations, if you even want to call them that, it's systematic. It's a matter of state policy, of state plans. I mean, the filtration camps, the kidnapping of children, the systematic war crimes that, we don't even want to catalog because it's so gruesome. The filtration camps, there was that essay, What Do We Want in Ukraine, which talks about, quote, defascistization. It's just unbelievable. I came across a paper. It was from, I could send it to you if you want. It's in my essays. I hate to keep on referring it, but, at least I'm trying to be a little legitimate about everything here. But it talks about how the plans for Russia's occupation of entire Ukraine was known. It was published in a British military paper. And basically they talked about how they would essentially pillage and rape the country and basically erase its entire identity, rip out all the technology, give Ukraine's nuclear program over to Rosatom, which is a Russian, as you know, state nuclear agency, and all the rest of it, create a puppet government, create what the Russians apparently termed a movement for peace to basically seize control of the government and everything else. And the thing is that Russia wants to expand westward. I mean, if you follow J.R. Nyquist and some of his podcasts, I mean, there's talk about Russia engaging in mobilizations near the Baltic border of Baltic countries and Poland. We know about Russia funding various extreme right-wing populist and left-wing, ultra-left-wing groups selectively in Europe, business size, etc. The thing of it is you mentioned one thing about the aid and the need for Ukraine to develop its domestic production, which I totally agree with. And in fact, many individuals, Brandon Weichart, Philip Pilkington, are DOD previously under, say, the first Trump administration. You have generals talking about this. The deindustrialization that has occurred in the United States has actually impaired our capacity to aid our allies, particularly in Taiwan, as well as Ukraine. So I wanted to affirm your point there. But here's an interesting quote, because I heard your latest debate panel and I just felt like screaming, because these peace agreements with Putin, why in the hell would you trust a government that's infused, to put it in right-wingy terms, with Bolshevik political and intelligence and military culture and ethics? You cut off the aid. Yeah, Ukraine's going to fight like hell. Europe will probably step in. But there's a reason why you can't trust Putin. It's very similar to the Vietnam War and the last stages. You sign an agreement, the Paris Peace Accords. Okay, we're not going to bother each other, Mr. Viet Cong, Mr. North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. Americans start to withdraw troops. We started to scale down aid for varying reasons. But of course, the North Vietnamese just marched into South Vietnam. End of story. When you look at, I know China was floated as a potential partner to monitor a sort of DMZ between the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics and the rest of the sovereign Ukrainian state. Bad idea to put a country like China that is allied to Russia. Historical example, Poland and Hungary, which were Warsaw Pact countries during the Vietnam War, as you know, were part of the ICC, the International Control Commission, which was supposed to monitor events after the Geneva Accords of 1954, which temporarily subdivided Vietnam into North and South Vietnam. And there was supposed to be elections that were supposed to unify Vietnam, as you know. But what did the Poles and Hungarians do? They passed intelligence to the North Vietnamese while posing as neutral ICC observers. So that's my response. You can't trust them for that. You can't trust China or Belarus or Hungary or whatnot. My other thing I wanted to point out is Putin is counting on the withdrawal of aid through potentially peace agreements or isolation sentiment in the United States. And he said, and before the Valdai Discussion Club back in 2023, by and large, the Ukrainian economy cannot exist without external support. Once you stop this, everything will be over in a week. Finish. The same applies to the defense system. Imagine that supplies will stop tomorrow. You will only have a week to live when the ammunition runs out. So that's why, as far as I'm concerned, they want the peace agreement. They want the eventual abandonment of Ukraine to the tender mercies of the Russians. Did you have any other information to add on this? Am I wrong? Am I making up shit? Am I alarmist? Or what's your take?
I mean, the Russian goal is whatever agreement is signed leaves Ukraine in a position where they can most easily invade them again, and the most difficult speed bumps in between them and their goals are gone. That's why their priority in negotiations is getting the rest of Donetsk, where all the bunkers, where the heights are, where the most defensible territory is, where Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which are the last free capitals of the Donbass, and where all these people who have had their lives turned upside down over and over and over again by the invasion have now decided to reside themselves, because it's the closest place from home, after getting displaced. And they have turned it into a fucking fortress. And so it'd be a lot easier than having to deal with a situation where there's drones so dominant, you have to go over so many fields, lose so much personnel, lose so much men, then just get the Ukrainians to give it up in negotiations. And then when you invade again, you'll invade into the open fields of some demilitarized zone, which is going to be held by a few thousand UN peacekeepers that you can arrest quickly. Something that would be fragile enough that if they were to break it, Ukraine would shatter. That's why at the start of the war, they were demanding Ukraine's demilitarization. That's why that demand has, as far as I know, never formally been taken off the table. That is why the Russians are demanding they give up all the defensible territory before peace talks can begin. And it's also why they continue to even say, if Ukraine gives up that territory, they're not going to recognize Kherson and Zaporizhia as Ukrainian territory because it's already in the Russian constitution, so they can come back and take it later. So everything that you see from the Russians when they say, "Oh, no, we will give them Russian security guarantees. Don't worry about it," and they say, "Okay, so we can have European troops in that territory." Of course not. No, because that's something that could complicate it. If Germans and Spaniards and Frenchmen and Brits started dying in the Donbass, well, that's something that could change the equation of how much military support is actually being sent out there. And it would also mean that if they invaded again, they aren't just fighting the Ukrainians. And so that's why every time where there's an agreement that's proposed where the Europeans act as a peacekeeping force, it has been rejected because they see it as a backdoor towards not only NATO, but also, more importantly, a force that they can't trounce, a force that they can't roll over. Because the Ukrainians, compared to the Russians, even with all of their tools and innovation, it has a lot of trouble dealing with a country so much bigger than it. 5 and 6 of the biggest economies in Europe adding their hats into the ring would change the equation quite a lot. And so that's why, even though Trump seemed pretty favorable towards that idea, because the Europeans deal with most of the risk, the Europeans are the ones on the ground taking the biggest cost expense. What does Trump have to do? Maybe air support, intelligence support. He gets to cheerlead from the sideline. Like, that's something that would actually be quite beneficial for him. But the Russians haven't acted on that idea because the Russians don't want anything in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to be a hollowed out husk to both show as not only an easy target for the future, where Putin can once again try to assert his demands that Ukraine either exists as part of Russia or not at all, but also as an example of what happens to a country in Russia's backyard, which, basically any country that touches the largest country on the planet, that goes through multiple time zones, that this is what the end result is, as an example.
And what do you think Russia, I mean, I talked about it, obviously, but what are your thoughts of Russia's long-term goals? Do they want to stop at Ukraine? What are your sources in Ukraine and in the United States and elsewhere tell you?
Well, I don't really have much source. I mean, you'd have to go to the Russians for that to really know exactly where they want to stop. But I'm of the belief that they'll stop where they can, or where they have to. For example, I think that this Russian government absolutely would invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania if they could get away with it. It's just that NATO membership complicates it. I think that they would 100% invade and topple the government of Moldova if they can get away with it. It's just having 2 wars, and with Ukraine being right there, it's kind of complicated. And if you invade 2 countries at the same time, there's no better way to basically ring like a dinner bell of say we are a problem. So I think that might be something that's pushed for later. Georgia is a country that right now is politically friendly enough that they don't have too much concerns with, but there have been people caught by Armenian authorities that were apparently being trained by the Russians for potential coup attempts in Yerevan. So the Russians still have interests outside of Ukraine. It's just maybe in the future they'll proceed with other ideas. Like, for example, hey, getting somebody like Kishtoroglu to win in Romania might be a lot cheaper than invading Romania. Having somebody who's going to be friendlier might be a little better. But because of his imperialistic view of the Ukrainians, his bigoted view of the Ukrainians as this lesser little brother than people of the Russian Volk, the Russian Ruski Mir, it's a lot harder for me to see him letting go of it, especially since Putin's already highlighted his beliefs like very clearly at the start of the invasion. I think what he wrote at the start of the invasion, the papers he published, and what he said at the very start is probably the most honest you get of Putin. Not because he didn't lie, but because there's certain underlying truths which cannot be denied from his actions and the way he talks about the Ukrainians. Not that he didn't lie and try to say things like, "Oh, I'm invading because that Harry Potter author is being discriminated against." Like, no, that probably wasn't all that true. But I think when it comes to his imperial beliefs about Ukraine, we saw that Tucker Carlson interview. That dude is a Reddit history nerd of the highest extent, who is purely looking at through a Russian nationalist lens of Russia was inevitable because it is Russia. The people who, everybody descends from the Ruski, everybody descends from the peoples before us are Russia. That's his hyper focus. He believes it. So I think he still wants it. It's just whether or not the wall in front of him is too big to stop him. Hey, IRI, thanks for the raid. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So why? Here's my next thing. Just your opinion. Why are so many right-wingers, not all, but many of them seem to be in the streamers and the, even on the Tucker Carlson you mentioned and others. Why are they so either pro-Russia, pro-Putin, or they might not say they're pro-Russia, pro-Putin, like we like their government, we think Russia's Christian, we think it's nationalist and anti-woke. Why do you think they're either apologists for Russia or pro-Russia? Is it active measures? What is your take? You've studied this very deeply. So what's your take and experience?
I mean, I studied assumes I went to some university and I and I smoked a pipe and I read all the books and such. I did smoke a pipe, but it was mostly through just my personal conversations with some of these fellas and through just watching a lot of this content. So from walking in these spaces and walking in these circles, from my experience, it's a whole host of reasons. I'll start with the easy ones. People are paid. Benny Johnson got a lot of money.
Yep.
And you don't just start saying things like, oh, the Moscow shooter seems to be a Ukrainian agent. Oh my gosh, this mall shooting, when it was clearly ISIS. You could see the shooters, like you could see them clearly after, like it's very obviously it's ISIS. It was done by ISIS. Though you could see their gunplay. They're not trained Ukrainian agents. You can see how they operate. They opt like untrained religious extremists. But we had people at Tenet Media, which was a Russian outfit that was not only in Benny Johnson's pocket, was in Tim Pool's pocket, was in Lauren Southern's pocket, was in the pocket of other smaller conservative commentators. So some people are paid, and it's hard for me to not correlate somebody saying Ukraine is the biggest enemy to the world, to everybody, to everything, as Tim Pool did, outside of that payment he got, because he did cover Euromaidan back in the day. People forget this, and he did not lie about Euromaidan. He was not like a huge he wasn't like going out there saying there's a bunch of fascists on the street. He was like, oh, people are here for a lot of economic reasons. People talk about corruption. He was being relatively, like, it was pretty shallow, but it was relatively accurate. Mm-hmm. And so from him to go from that to Ukraine is the biggest enemy to all things of all time that has ever existed, bigger threat than climate change, bigger threat than a global pandemic, bigger threat than any type of like water crisis. Like the bigger threat than all of that is Ukraine itself for being invaded and fighting back. And then he ends up getting paid by the Russians. So some people, I think, quite frankly, are just paid. That doesn't mean that you cannot be paid and both believe it, because a lot of times the Russians or paid and be a useful idiot. That happens too, because somebody can stumble into believing something and really believe it and then deal with the benefits of believing that. As was the case with people like Jackson Hinkle when he got the Hiroshima Award or other types of grants when he defended the Assad regime. And I debated him on the Assad regime. He doesn't know really much of anything about the Assad regime. He just remembers some Gray Zone articles he read about chemical weapons attacks. So these are people that I think might believe it after doing some shallow research and then benefited from the market that does exist for people who are willing to carry water for some of the most disgusting regimes in the world, because those regimes have pocketbooks and they want to whitewash their image and they're willing to help them. So those people do exist, and we're seeing them get exposed in real time. And I don't believe the Russians have stopped. I think, if anything, the Russians have probably picked up operations because they see Donald Trump as a success story, and they see the sentiment amongst some of these people as a success story. That doesn't mean that popular sentiment has changed amongst the American people. We all love authoritarian Russian government now, but that's just to say that they have seen successes and they want to build upon them. So I think those are a big portion. For the people who genuinely believe it or get paid and also believe it and aren't just doing it for money, I think part of them are just people of a contrarian nature, people who see that MSNBC is saying this, CNN is saying that, this person in the suit is saying this. I can't say that. I'm not with that. I think for some on the left, particularly on the hard left, that they're pretty dominated by that, especially when you balance that with the aesthetically difficult problem for some leftists to ever support sending weapons to a foreign government to blow people up. Because from their messaging from like the Woodstock movement and the anti-Vietnam War protests, and from the prioritization of us, of the left protesting against basically every major American military involvement outside of maybe the Yugoslav Civil War, because it was very hard to see what was going on and say, don't do anything. And Ukraine's been like that in Congress, but it hasn't necessarily been like that on the far left. When I went to that Rage Against the War Machine rally, there were a lot of people waving hammer and sickle flags, stuff like that. And some of that comes from on the left as well, Russophilia. People who remember the Soviet Union, they're like, and they, oh, I love the babushkas, I love this, and there's a certain amount of Russophilia that exists, both on the left for people who remember the Soviet Union and on the right for people who now think like Russia's this based trad, Christian representation of, hardcore Christian values, even though it has some of the lowest church attendance rates of the Christian world, has extremely high rates of alcohol fetal syndrome, has extremely high rates of AIDS and HIV infection, has extremely high rates of poverty and just corruption within the church, government control of the church, and the use of the church as a weapon of war. You can call Russia Christian if you want to, and there are people who believe it because they simply have the same enemies as they do: the LGBT people, the trans people, things that they consider degenerate. And for some of them, they even see it as kind of like, oh, he's like the kind of the strong representation of Christianity fighting for it. But Russia's a country that, and this isn't something that I particularly mind. All countries are diverse, but Russia's a country that's becoming more Muslim by the day. I mean, by 2030, 2040, Russia's going to be 1/3 Muslim. And so, I just don't know how anybody really thinks that Russia's going to be like the Christian crusader country that's going to like tear through the world and bring about an end towards, maybe the hope is they'll get an alliance between radical Islamists and radical Christian fundamentalists and purge the queers together, and a big rainbow will go overhead as all the Abrahamic religions fuse. But it just doesn't make much sense. At least to me. But there are people who see them as a representation of strong, good Christianity.
Yeah, no.
But I would say that Jesus would probably want them to make possession of child pornography illegal.
Yeah, but it gets even more mysterious. Putin, in an interview, I believe with CNN, was asked a question why he was wearing a cross like well over 20 years ago when he first became president/dictator. And he said, I don't believe in the power of God. I believe in the power of man. He's very evasive at times on what he believes. When he was asked by a Cuban journalist back in the year 2000, he asked Putin when he was visiting Cuba in 2000, are you a communist or a capitalist? He says, call me a pot, but heat me not. Putin has stated that he likes communist and socialist ideas. When you have Igor Sechin, for example, was described some years ago, his office adorned with all kinds of the works of Lenin, photos of Che Guevara and whatnot. So I think Russia is a riddle wrapped up in an enigma. And part of the problem is, I suspect, is our human intelligence has not been good. Our understanding of communist and really totalitarian politics and deception really is not up to par, unfortunately. When you look at this based trad, Russia is hosting at least two events, the Old Communist Front World Youth Festival last year and the year before, where the Center for Political Innovation and the Party of Communist USA, and I think even some CPUSA people might have been there. Definitely Party of Communist USA.
What I think it is? I think it's two things. I think one thing is Russia likes to benefit from the legacy of the Soviet Union that it has with leftist causes around the world, and it has continued to try to use that when it comes to North Korea, for example. How that relationship is now rebirthed in a way where I would say right now the relationship between North Korea and Russia is probably the best it's been since 1950. I can't think of any other period in time where they've found themselves this strategically aligned. Who really thought that ever, not even talk about the 21st century, we would see communist troops from the Korean Peninsula invading Europe? Nobody really thought that would be here, but that's what we are. And we could also see that legacy with certain South American leftist movements, other leftist movements in Africa, and this legacy of leftist anti-colonial struggle in Africa has particularly helped them when it comes to their propaganda campaign, definitely when trying to push the French out and put themselves in, even as they engage in massacres in Mali and some really horrific stuff in the CAR. Some of the success stories of some decreases in terrorism in places like the CAR has helped them, but right now in West Africa, they are getting eaten alive. and it is quite honestly horrific to watch. And as much as I don't really root for Russian governmental power right now, I'm really scared for the people on the ground who are getting new announcements of like the banning of a new tomato paste factory every other day, or like the banning of like the new of gay this or gay that, because they're losing a new village every other day, and they need whatever they can to fill the airwaves to cover up the mess that's currently being made there.
Mm. Yeah, it's really unbelievable, and that's one of the things that raises alarm bells. Russia's backing of these various leftist military regimes in Africa that you just referenced, also South America, Venezuela, Cuba, MAS in Bolivia, Nicaragua, of course, Belarus, which is basically an unreconstructed Soviet republic that still technically calls itself socialist and whatnot. So you just scratch your head. And I think Russia essentially wants power. I think we could probably agree with that. And they want to, and I don't think, honestly, and this is highly controversial, we could do another.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I forgot. I didn't say the second thing.
No problem. Go ahead.
The second reason as to why I think they like to continue to string this along is that the Soviet Union was around for a large portion of Russian history. So there's certain parts of it that you have to adopt because that was your people for like that's your grandfather's history, right? And so there's certain parts about it like space exploration and scientific achievements, and all certain parts of it which you can adopt, you can still be proud of, you can still be happy about. But there's certain legacies of it, the quite brutal repressive legacies of it, when we talk about the centralization of control around certain key figures, or like, for example, the repackaging of Stalin in recent days,
Yes.
As they're starting to roll out Stalin statues again and worship Stalin. The repressive tactics of the Soviet Union were also quite revolutionary. They really got to they really figured out how to purge properly. They really figured out how to get your neighbors to monitor your neighbors for you. They really figured out a lot of stuff that is still useful in the 21st century. So outside of just the base, every human needs a history, every people needs a story, which I understand, there's also a usefulness to the repressive tactics that were developed in the Soviet Union that they're leaning into quite openly with the Stalin worship again.
Yeah, and they've been doing Stalin worship, and even the right once upon a time ago, WorldNet Daily and Newsmax covered that. J.R. Nyquist, when he wrote for them like 20 some odd years ago, they renamed at one point the Russian intelligence, the MVD, the Ministry of State Security. They dusted off the statue, I believe, of Felix Dzerzhinsky. They had Lenin statues, from what I understand, even in the Donetsk People's Republic, apparently, and they're also unveiling them too. Look, I think the Cold War never really ended. I think, and this is based on research that I've done, basically the Communist Party, Soviet Union went underground. They had to relabel themselves, and they had economic challenges. I mean, so did we in the 1980s. We don't like to talk about that, but they had real economic challenges, and they wanted to get rid of the image of the enemy. And Gorbachev, in declassified documents, has talked about that. And I know it sounds like some crazy conspiracy theories, but when you piece it all together, it really makes you ask questions. Where Gorbachev, both openly and publicly, had talked about getting rid of the image of the enemy. And at first, I never believed it until I started to really go into the details. And there's enough that I've covered and others have covered that really make you think, And this is confirmed by defectors from the Russian SVR and military during the 1990s and early 2000s. Sergei Tretyakov, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, who defected in 1992, and told some very terrifying tales, and many others that I could list as well. What was his name? Konstantin Przebrzydzinski. You had the KGB whistleblower, Victor and Marina, his wife, Kalashnikov, who died, from what I understand. So you have a number of these people, and it just makes you think. Wow.
I mean, I understand. Like, I think there's two ways of thinking about it. Some people think about it like there's chapters in history, There's there's a chapter of repressive Soviet communism, then there's a chapter of Russian freedom, and then there's a chapter of Putinism. But there were violent coups. It wasn't just like the Soviet Union collapsed one day and then everybody. No, there were protests in the Baltics. People chained arms together, saying "Kumbaya." There was a whole process before the whole system collapsed. And the figures that were involved in the Soviet Union and preserving the Soviet Union, who wanted the Soviet Union to stay around, it's not like they all just died. But some of them died. So of course, many of them are very old, right? But many of them passed down that legacy to people who believed in that stuff around them, passed it down to younger people. They kept getting involved in politics. Many of them became big oligarchs in business, and they bought up the industry once everything was getting sold for pennies on the dollar. And so I think that it's not as simple as like, oh, the book closed and then everybody in Russia agreed we'll be friendly with the West. Is a lot of people were convinced, let's give it a shot. This is so garbage. Our kids are prostituting themselves on the street, which was a real thing. Yes. Doing drugs like crazy. It's gang violence is out of this world right now. Many people, can't really make ends meet anymore. We need to try something new. Let's give this Western thing a shot, right? And those freedoms always sounded cool anyway, too. And so they gave it a shot. A lot of them did, but not everyone. Some people always thought it was a gimmick, or they'd be like, look, maybe I like this part or that part of it, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians are still Russian. And if you go through the 90s, if you go through like the talk of Boris Yeltsin or all these other people, you can still see Russian chauvinism there. I mean, where did the first war in Chechnya happen? When did it happen? Under whose administration? And what was his policy towards Ukraine and its atomic arsenal? Was that if it didn't hand over its atomic arsenal, they would invade them. So that Russia can have atomic weapons, Ukraine can have atomic weapons. That was under Yeltsin. That doesn't mean that Yeltsin had necessarily agreed that Ukrainians can never be real. We're going to take it over. We're going to invade one day. But it does show that these ideas didn't just disappear overnight, and that a lot of these people didn't disappear overnight. So when you say the Cold War never ended, I won't say that it never ended as in the way we think of the Cold War, of these two geopolitical blocks 100% facing each other down, societies sent on a knife's edge to aim at towards one another and hold in preparation of some event that may or may not come. But I will agree, for some people, it never ended and will never end.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. And to close out, before we wrap up, what would you recommend? I totally agree with your position on Ukraine revitalizing its domestic defense industrial base. Totally agree with you on that. But what would you recommend for a policy forward for the United States as well as the Zelensky government to do to defend themselves, essentially, and revitalize Ukraine policy on the American end?
Say that one more time.
Yeah, sure. Well, break it down. What would you recommend moving forward Ukraine should do is to defend itself, to make it as impervious as possible to Russian aggression, especially in the event the U.S. withdraws aid or forces a peace agreement that it possibly might be violated by Russia?
I think that one thing they need to do, which they are doing currently, is they need to pitch their drone industry to tons of countries across the board, some traditional allies, others allies of convenience, or others business partners out of convenience, in order to get as much investment into the drone industry as possible. Right now, 80% of casualties, 85% of casualties or something, some crazy amount right now are from drones. So these drones have taken a lot of the pressure off of the manpower shortage, that not that it doesn't still, that they still can't feel it, but with this drones, they can cover a lot more territory than they traditionally could if they had the men without the drones. I mean, with rifles, they would need many more men to cover that territory. And so what they've been able to transform into is a kind of, anytime the Russians penetrate, they send in cleanup crews like they did outside of Pokrovsk when they penetrated 10 kilometers deep to the north of the city. So this investment and continuing this investment so that this giant disparity that will never change between Ukraine and Russia's population can continue to be defended against with drones is extremely important. But also, you can't beat a man. You can't beat a man with a rifle. Men can do tasks that robots cannot. And as much as you need robots to take up more of the logistical burden in order to transport goods because of how dangerous it is, that last 15 kilometers between your supply depot and the front line, with how much drone coverage there is, how much artillery fire there is, at the end of the day, you need more men. And so they need to find a way to get more men in the armed forces. Ukraine does. Again, like I said earlier, that they could either do that through improving the armed forces so more people volunteer, or get more people. And that means changing the law. And that means cracking down on dodging. And that means finding the SBU agents that are getting paid off to take people off of the conscription rolls and removing them for their positions permanently. That means finding the people who are engaging in abuses towards anybody in the armed forces, people who are stealing. It means really cleaning shit up in a way that might make some people upset. But it's necessary. If they don't rattle a few cages, then the Russians are going to rattle their cage, and they don't really have any other choice. As for what else they can do, I mean, it's going to be a question of supply. It's going to be a question of using territory, trading territory for lives as the Russians continue to push forward. What they need to do is not have another Bakhmut. What they need to do is make sure that you don't just keep dedicating more and more troops into an unfavorable partial encirclement in order to hold it, in order to please somebody above you, in order to get somebody a promotion, or in order to hold a city hopelessly. Every piece of territory in Ukraine is not naturally defensible. You need to lean into the locations that are naturally defensible, and that might be mean some difficult decisions about losing this tree line, that tree line, or this village and that village. But you need to use the material you have right now, because with American support uncertain and the end of the war nowhere in sight, you need to get and use whatever you can, and you need to be able to string out that support as long as you can.
What about on the psychological front? Because often what we're Cold War, standing up for anti-communist allies in the Cold War, for example, there was a lack of a real counter-propaganda campaign. And I see that occurring here in the United States, and the Russians gaining advantages in the information war. What do you think Ukraine should do in regards? Yes, they have their obviously list of disinformation agents throughout the world and whatnot, but on the public diplomacy and information warfare, what should Ukraine do different or more of?
I think I want to see Zelensky doing more shows like Lex Friedman's. Now, of course, maybe me and Lex Friedman will not agree on how that interview should have been done, or the types of questions that should have been asked. But I think that Zelensky, if you look in the replies, people hadn't really heard the Ukrainian story in that type of environment at that length, delivered in such a human way, such a sincere way, and so simply as Zelensky, somebody who has extensive media trained experience and who has worked in media well before, being the center of the entire world's attention, which he was. When the Russians were trying to assassinate him over and over and over again at the start of the world, he had to communicate his nation's story to the world for the first time ever, and he did successfully. So I think that even though, of course, it comes with a certain amount of risk, and they should not go on programs that will set him up for something, like I don't think he should be going on Benny Johnson's program. I do not think that he should be going on programs that are going to sabotage him. But I wouldn't even be against him going on a program like Charlie Kirk's if it means he can get his message out to people who might have not heard that story before, because the person who watches 60 Minutes has already heard it a few times. They might need to hear a little bit more about the human safari. They might need to hear more about some other details, but Zelensky is a really good messenger, and I think they should utilize his most valuable skill, at least when it comes to how the West has seen him, more on more authentic platforms of the United States outside of traditional media.
Yeah, you referenced the Lex Friedman interview. I was listening to that when I was visiting some friends in North Carolina driving. And one thing that stood out to me, of many things, but there was one thing, and I know it might seem insignificant, but Zelensky, and I say this to the MAGA audience out there, is more MAGA than you think, and nationalist. For example, when the Lex Friedman interview, Zelensky said he would welcome foreign investment, but he did not want Ukraine to be a reservoir of cheap labor. He did say that. I remember that explicitly. And then there was an interview he did. Well, he didn't do it, but he talked about, I think it was with Jeffrey Kane on some reindustrialization forum. And this one fellow who interviewed him talked about how we need to clean up it was from Jeffrey Kane of the Lincoln Network. And he recalled a panel discussion that was facilitated by the Foundation for American Innovation, where Zelensky pleaded for the US and Europe to cease strategic trade with Russia, clean up your supply chains, and please build up your industry. And, you know, I want to say that purposely to more of the right-wing viewers who don't like Zelensky because maybe he's too woke and this and that and everything else. That this man
what the hell? No, what does that mean? Zelensky is too woke. What was the woke thing? I would really like to hear from any of these people. What's the woke law or the woke policy or even the woke statement from Zelensky? The wokest thing I can even imagine of Zelensky is once he was asked, "Hey, do you want? Will we have civic unions maybe for the soldiers who are dying?" And he said, "We're working on it." That's the closest thing you can get to a, and that's not woke. That's just like, I'll let you file taxes differently. You know, that's what that is. And but when they say woke, it's just taking Zelensky, a square peg, taking your circle culture war hole and doing everything you can to slam him into it, because that's the only way these people know how to communicate.
Yeah, and that's why I purposely said this. I mean, I know you kind of winced when I talked about the cheap labor thing. I don't know, maybe you don't find it significant, but I looked at it, I'm like, you know, those aspects of Zelensky's thinking need to be focused in on more. That this guy is not some globalist, and you and I know that's how he's portrayed, a puppet of globalists, of Soros, of BlackRock, and all the rest of it. But yet, and there are concerns that, hey, you know, all these financiers are going to exploit Ukraine and all the rest of it and everything. But when you look at him and you look at the details of different interviews and conversations and do even some cursory research, you'll find this is, well, you know, this is, he's not a globalist, and he's more of a nationalist than I think people could, you know, give credit.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and look, if the problem is that there's people around him who are corrupt, nobody has that problem with Viktor Orban. Nobody has that problem with Donald Trump. So, I mean, like, I really don't, like, yeah, I mean, Zelensky isn't woke. People need to stop trying to fit him into like the dumb American like perspective on politics. American politics is American politics, not Ukrainian politics, not Finnish politics, not Russian politics. American politics affects politics all around the world, but don't just assume that everybody else is lined up to your social framing. That it's Zelensky's America's Joe Biden, and who's their Donald Trump? Is it Poroshenko? It's its own thing. It's a little different. The world's a very big place.
So, yeah, any concluding comments, Dylan, that you'd like to add? Where could people on my end find your work on social media, your YouTube, and other sort of resources?
You can find me wandering around Eastern Ukraine. If you find me there, you can ask me, and I'll tell you a story about the campfire. That's how you can find me.
Okay.
You know, DylanBurnsTV is where my documentaries are, if anyone wants to see any of my films.
Okay, great. And can I plug in my stuff?
Sure.
Okay, yep. People can find me on New Ideas. That's my YouTube channel. People can find my books on Amazon.com, self-published, as well as my Substack, which is called Wilderness of Mirrors. If you're interested in what I have to say, just feel free to check it out. And thank you so much for having me, Dylan. I hope to have you in future conversations as events unravel.
Awesome. You stay safe, okay?
Yeah, you too. Be safe. God bless. Take care now.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.